August 27th, 479 BC. The sun had barely broken the horizon over the plains of Boeotia when the world changed forever. On a dusty stretch of ground between the Asopus River and the town of Plataea, two civilizations prepared to collide in what would become the decisive battle of the Greco-Persian Wars. But this wasn't just another clash of armies. This was the moment when Persian cavalry, the most feared military force in the known world, would smash headlong into the Spartan shield wall, and nothing would ever be the same. The story of Plataea begins a year earlier, with smoke rising from the ruins of Athens. The Persian king Xerxes had done what many thought impossible. He'd crossed the Hellespont with the largest army the world had ever seen, crushed the Spartans at Thermopylae, and burned the greatest city in Greece to the ground. But then came Salamis. In the narrow straits between the Greek mainland and the island of Salamis, the Persian fleet was destroyed. Xerxes, watching from his golden throne on the hillside, saw his dreams of conquest sink beneath the waves. The great king packed up and went home, taking most of his army with him. But he left behind his best general, Mardonius, with orders to finish what he'd started, and Mardonius had over 100,000 men to do it. Mardonius was no fool. He knew the Greeks were terrified, divided and exhausted. So he offered them a deal. "Surrender now," he said, "and we'll give you new lands, better lands, become our allies and share in the riches of the Persian Empire." The offer was generous. It was also calculated to split the Greek alliance apart. Because Mardonius knew what every Greek knew. When the Persians offered you a deal, they meant it. Other Greek cities had already made their peace with Persia. Thebes, one of the most powerful cities in Greece, had sided with the invaders. Why should Athens and Sparta keep fighting a war they couldn't win? But the Greeks said no. According to the historian Herodotus, the Athenians replied that as long as the sun moved in the heavens, they would never make peace with Xerxes. They would fight to defend Greece or die trying. It was one of the boldest gambles in military history, because the Greeks knew they were facing impossible odds. They had no cavalry to counter the Persian horsemen. They were outnumbered by at least 2-1, possibly 3-1, and they were about to fight on terrain that favoured everything the Persians did best. Mardonius positioned his army on the plains of Boeotia near Plataea. He chose this ground carefully. The flat, open terrain was perfect for cavalry operations. The Persians could maneuver, harass and surround the slower Greek infantry. Mardonius built a massive fortified camp on the north bank of the Asopus River, a square wooden stockade covering more than a square mile. This wasn't just a military position, it was a statement. The Persians were here to stay, and they had the resources to wait as long as it took for the Greeks to make a mistake. The Greek army assembled slowly, contingent by contingent, city by city. They marched north from the Peloponnese, through mountain passes and across valleys, until they reached Plataea in late July 479 BC. The combined force was massive by Greek standards, somewhere around 40,000 hoplites, the heavily armoured infantry that were the backbone of Greek warfare, supported by perhaps another 70,000 lightly armed troops. The overall commander was Pausanias, nephew of the legendary King Leonidas who had died at Thermopylae. Pausanias was young, probably in his mid-20s, but he had the weight of Spartan military tradition behind him, and one of the finest armies ever assembled at his command. The Greeks positioned themselves in the foothills south of the Persian camp. They refused to come down onto the plain, and for good reason. Greek hoplite warfare was based on the phalanx, a formation where heavily armoured men stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, spears projecting forward. The phalanx was nearly unstoppable in a head-on collision on level ground, but it had critical vulnerabilities. It couldn't manoeuvre quickly, it was defenceless on the flanks and rear, and it absolutely could not stand up to cavalry in open terrain. The Greeks needed broken, rocky ground where the Persian cavalry couldn't operate effectively, so they dug in on the slopes and waited. For 11 days neither side attacked. It was a stalemate born of tactical reality. The Greeks didn't dare come down onto the plain where the Persian cavalry would tear them apart. The Persians didn't want to attack uphill into prepared Greek positions where their cavalry advantage would be neutralized. Each side waited for the other to make a mistake. But beneath this apparent calm, both armies were suffering, the Greeks especially. Because Mardonius wasn't content to just wait. He was using his cavalry to make the Greeks' lives miserable. Persian cavalry in 479 BC was the product of centuries of refinement. The core of Mardonius's mounted force came from Persia itself, supplemented by Medes, Bactrians, and the fearsome Sacae, who the Greeks knew as Scythians. These were some of the finest horsemen in the world. They'd grown up in the saddle, learned to shoot a bow from horseback before they could read, and could ride for days without rest. They wore light armour, usually a leather tunic reinforced with bronze or iron scales, and carried a composite bow, the most advanced projectile weapon of the ancient world. The composite bow was a marvel of engineering, made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, capable of piercing armour at ranges that would have been impossible with simpler bows. The Persian cavalry's basic tactic was harassment. They would ride within range of Greek positions, loose volleys of arrows, then wheel away before the Greeks could respond. It was infuriating. The Greek hoplites, weighed down by 60 pounds of bronze armour, helmet, shield and weapons, couldn't catch the swift Persian horsemen. They could only stand there and take it, hiding behind their shields while arrows rained down. Some got through, men died, others were wounded, and even when the arrows didn't penetrate, the psychological effect was devastating. You'd hear the drumming of hooves, the whistling of arrows, and all you could do was crouch behind your shield and pray. But Mardonius's cavalry did more than just shoot arrows. They raided Greek supply lines. Remember, the Greeks had 110,000 men camped in the foothills. That's 110,000 mouths to feed every day. Food had to come up from the Peloponnese through mountain passes. The Persian cavalry found these supply columns and slaughtered them. Lightly armed Greek supply troops had no chance against mounted warriors. Wagons were burned, pack animals killed, supplies destroyed. Within days, the Greeks were starting to go hungry. Water was the other problem. The Greeks had initially positioned themselves near the Gargaphia spring, a fresh water source that could supply their entire army. But after several days of skirmishing, Persian cavalry broke through and destroyed it. The ancient sources say they somehow fouled or blocked the spring, making it unusable. Suddenly the Greeks couldn't get water, and you need water, especially in the heat of a Greek summer. Wearing bronze armour, the human body dehydrates fast. Men started to suffer. Some collapsed. The situation was becoming desperate. On about the 10th day of the standoff, something happened that should have broken Greek morale completely, but instead became a turning point. A Persian cavalry commander named Masistius led a direct assault on the Greek positions. Masistius was one of Mardonius's most trusted officers, a warrior of great reputation. He rode a magnificent Nisaean horse, one of the prized war horses of the Persian Empire, and he wore gilded scale armour that flashed in the sun. His attack focused on the Megarian contingent, one of the smaller Greek forces. The Megarians were taking heavy casualties from the mounted archers and couldn't hold out. They sent word to Pausanias begging for help. Pausanias dispatched Athenian archers to support them, and this is where we see one of the keys to the eventual Greek victory. The Greeks had learned from their defeats. They'd learned that you can't just rely on heavy infantry. You need combined arms. The Athenian archers weren't as numerous as Persian mounted archers, but they were disciplined and accurate. They began shooting back. Persian cavalry, unused to facing serious archery fire, began taking casualties. Their attacks lost coordination. Then someone, we don't know who, shot Masistius's horse. The magnificent Nisaean went down, and Masistius, despite his heavy armour and elite status, couldn't get clear in time. He hit the ground hard. Greek hoplites saw him fall and rushed forward. What happened next became one of the most discussed moments of the pre-battle period. The Greeks tried to kill Masistius, but they couldn't penetrate his armour. His scale armour, probably gilded bronze or even iron scales sewn onto a leather backing, turned their spear thrusts. Desperate, the Greeks finally thrust a spear up through his eye socket, the one gap in his defences. Masistius died instantly. The Greeks seized his body and paraded it through their camp. The ancient sources say everyone wanted to see him because he'd been so magnificent in battle. His armour, his weapons, his size and bearing all spoke to the quality of the Persian military elite. But here's what mattered. The Greeks had killed him. One of Persia's finest warriors was dead. When the Persians discovered what had happened, they charged en masse to recover the body. It turned into a vicious fight. Eventually the Greeks drove them off. The Persians withdrew to their camp and went into mourning. They shaved their heads and cut the manes of their horses, traditional signs of grief. The Greeks, meanwhile, celebrated. They'd proven that Persian cavalry could be beaten, but the strategic situation remained desperate. Without water, without adequate food supplies, the Greeks couldn't stay where they were. Pausanias called a council of war. The options were all bad. If they retreated in daylight, Persian cavalry would cut them to pieces. If they stayed, they'd die of thirst. The only option was to retreat at night to a new position closer to Plataea, where there was water and better protection from cavalry harassment. So on the evening of the 11th day, Pausanias gave the order. The Greek army would withdraw under cover of darkness to a position called the Island, a piece of ground between two streams of the river Oyeroa, about 2 miles back toward Plataea. From there, half the army would continue back to secure the mountain passes and re-establish supply lines. It was a complex manoeuvre, and it went wrong almost immediately. Night movements of large armies are difficult under the best circumstances. You can't see. Units get separated. Officers lose contact with their commands. And this was an allied Greek army, meaning it was made up of separate contingents from different cities, each with their own commanders and their own ideas about honour and tactics. As the order to withdraw spread through the camps, confusion reigned. Some units moved quickly, others hesitated. Still others refused to move at all. A Spartan officer named Masistius, commanding a battalion of Spartan hoplites, apparently told Pausanias he wouldn't retreat. The ancient sources present this as insubordination, but modern historians think it might have been more nuanced. Masistius may have been volunteering to hold the position as a rearguard while the rest of the army withdrew. Spartans were trained from childhood to stand and fight. Retreat, even tactical retreat, went against everything they believed in. Either way, Masistius and his men stayed on the ridge while the rest of the Spartan and Tegean forces began their withdrawal. The centre of the Greek line, composed of smaller contingents from various cities, moved first, but instead of going to the island as ordered, many of them went straight back to Plataea. Whether this was panic, confusion, or a deliberate decision to get closer to safety, we don't know. What we do know is that by dawn the Greek battle line had completely fragmented. The Spartans and Tegeans were strung out between their original position and a temple of Demeter about 2 miles south. Masistius's rearguard was still on the ridge. The Athenians on the left flank hadn't moved at all because they'd been waiting for orders that never came, and the centre had scattered back toward Plataea. The careful Greek formation was in pieces. When the sun rose on August 27th, 479 BC, Persian scouts splashed across the Asopus River and rode into the deserted Greek positions. They found empty camps, abandoned supplies, and no sign of the Greek army except dust clouds in the distance. The scouts galloped back to report to Mardonius. The Greeks were in full retreat. Mardonius couldn't believe his luck. The Greeks had broken. They were running. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. Without proper orders, without a careful plan, probably carried away by the excitement of apparent victory, Mardonius ordered his forces to pursue. The Persian army surged across the river. Infantry, cavalry, allied Greek troops fighting for Persia, everyone moved forward in a great disordered mass. They could see the Greek rearguard in the distance. They could taste victory. But they'd made a fatal mistake. The Greeks weren't retreating, they were repositioning. And Pausanias, watching from near the Temple of Demeter, was about to prove he was a far better general than anyone had given him credit for. The Spartans and Tegeans had reached the temple and taken up position. Masistius's rearguard was moving down from the ridge to join them. Together, they numbered about 11,500 men, facing the best of the Persian army. Pausanias sent a messenger racing to the Athenians with new orders. Join us if you can. If you can't, we'll fight alone. The Athenians tried to move, but they were intercepted by Theban hoplites and Persian cavalry. They couldn't break free. So Pausanias and his Spartans would have to hold alone. The Persian cavalry hit first. They came thundering across the plain, probably hundreds of them, perhaps more than 1,000. These were the mounted archers, the elite of Mardonius's army. They formed up in front of the Spartan position and began shooting. Arrows came down in waves. The Spartans locked their shields and waited. They'd trained their entire lives for this. From age 7, Spartan boys had been raised in the agog, the brutal military education system that turned them into the finest heavy infantry in the world. They knew how to stand under fire. They knew how to wait. But this wasn't just a few arrows. This was an arrow storm. Persian mounted archers could each lose 10 to 15 arrows per minute. If Mardonius had even 1,000 cavalry in that initial attack, that's 10,000 arrows per minute hammering into the Spartan line. The sound alone must have been overwhelming. The whistling of thousands of arrows in flight, the crack and thud as they hit shields, the screams when they found gaps in armour. Men fell. The Spartan line held, but it was taking casualties. Then the Persian infantry arrived. These weren't the lightly armed conscripts that made up much of the Persian army. These were the immortals, the elite 10,000, and Persian regulars, probably another 10 to 15,000 men. They advanced in formation, and according to the sources they planted their wicker shields in the ground to form a shield wall. These shields, called spara, were large rectangular wicker frames covered in leather or hide. Light, easy to carry, effective against arrows, not effective against Spartan spears in close combat, but from behind them, Persian archers could shoot with some protection. So now the Spartans were facing two layers of attack. Cavalry archers harassing them from the flanks, infantry archers shooting from behind planted shields to their front, and they couldn't advance because Pausanias refused to give the order. The ancient sources say Pausanias was waiting for favourable omens. Before any major military action, Greek commanders would sacrifice an animal and examine its entrails. The Spartans in particular took this very seriously. Pausanias kept sacrificing goats, but the omens kept coming back unfavourable, so he waited, and waited, while his men died around him. This is one of the strangest moments in the battle. Modern historians have debated what was really going on. Was Pausanias genuinely waiting for religious signs? Was he deliberately stalling to give the Athenians time to arrive? Was he waiting for the Persian formation to fully commit so it couldn't retreat easily? We'll never know. What we do know is that the Spartans and Tegeans stood under that arrow storm for what must have felt like an eternity. The discipline required is almost incomprehensible. You're standing there, men are dying next to you, arrows are hitting your shield so hard they're punching through, and you can't move, you can't attack, you can only stand and take it. At some point, according to Herodotus, Pausanias turned toward the temple of Hera in Plataea and prayed aloud for the goddess not to let them down. And at that exact moment the Tegeans, either unable to endure any longer or believing they'd waited long enough, charged. The omen suddenly became favourable. Pausanias gave the order. The Spartans charged. This is the moment. This is when Persian cavalry met the Spartan shield wall. But it wasn't a cavalry charge. The Persian cavalry had already withdrawn to reload after their arrow barrage. What the Spartans hit was the Persian infantry, shield wall, and it was a catastrophic mismatch. The Greek phalanx was designed for exactly this kind of fight. Each Spartan wore a bronze cuirass protecting his torso, a bronze helmet covering his head, and bronze greaves protecting his shins. He carried an aspis, a round bronze-faced shield about 3 feet in diameter, weighing 15 to 20 pounds, and he fought with a dory, a spear about 8 feet long with an iron head and a bronze butt spike. In the phalanx, Spartans stood in ranks 8 men deep. The front rank held their spears level. The second and third ranks could also project their spears forward over the shoulders of the men in front. The rear ranks held their spears vertically and pushed with their shields against the backs of the men ahead, adding their weight to the forward momentum. When the Spartan phalanx hit the Persian shield wall, physics took over. Persian infantry wore light armour, usually a padded tunic, maybe some scales or a lamella if they were elite troops. Their shields were wicker and leather. Their spears were short, maybe 6 feet long. They were trained for skirmish combat, for supporting cavalry, for fighting at range. Not for shoving matches with the most heavily armed infantry in the world. The first impact probably killed dozens of Persians instantly. Spartan spears punched through wicker shields like they were paper. The weight of the phalanx, thousands of pounds of armoured men pushing forward in perfect coordination, simply drove through the Persian line. The Persians tried to fight back. Ancient sources say they grabbed at the Greek spears, trying to break them or wrench them away. Some succeeded. Spear shafts snapped. But the Spartans had trained for this. When their spears broke, they drew their xiphos, their short iron swords, and kept fighting. Sword work in the crush of a phalanx wasn't elegant. It was brutal, efficient, desperate. Short thrusts into gaps in armour. Strikes at unprotected necks, armpits, groins. The Persians stood their ground. Give them credit. These were professional soldiers, veterans of campaigns across half the world. They didn't break immediately. They fought back with swords and daggers and whatever they could grab. But they were losing. The casualty ratio was probably 5 or 10 to 1 in favour of the Greeks. Every few seconds another Persian died while Spartans, protected by bronze and discipline, kept pushing forward. Then Mardonius arrived. The Persian general, seeing his infantry being ground down, personally led his elite bodyguard into the fight. Mardonius rode a white horse and was surrounded by 1,000 of his best men. Ancient sources describe him as fighting magnificently, trying to rally his troops through personal courage. It almost worked. Where Mardonius fought, the Persians held. His presence stabilized the line. For a few minutes, maybe longer, the outcome was genuinely in doubt. Then a Spartan hoplite named Masistius saw Mardonius on his white horse. He couldn't reach him with a spear. The crush of combat was too tight. So he did something that sounds almost comical but was actually tactically brilliant. He picked up a rock off the ground and threw it as hard as he could at Mardonius's head. The rock, probably the size of a grapefruit or larger, hit Mardonius squarely in the skull. He fell from his horse, either dead instantly or dying moments later. When Mardonius died, everything changed. Persian resistance collapsed. The soldiers didn't know their commander was dead immediately, but they could see his bodyguard beginning to waver. Word spread through the ranks. Mardonius is down. Mardonius is dead. Panic rippled through the Persian lines. Units began to pull back. The withdrawal turned into a rout. Persians fled toward their fortified camp with the Spartans and Tegeans pursuing, killing everyone they could catch. The Persian cavalry tried to cover the retreat. Theban cavalry fighting for the Persians charged into the pursuing Greeks and managed to slow them down long enough for many Persians to reach the camp, but thousands didn't make it. They were cut down in the open field. The survivors packed into the fortified camp and prepared to defend it. On the other side of the battlefield, the Athenians had been fighting their own desperate battle. Theban hoplites had engaged them, and these weren't conscripts. Thebes was one of the major Greek cities and fielded excellent troops. The fight was vicious. Greek hoplite against Greek hoplite, both sides using identical equipment and tactics. It came down to discipline and endurance. The Athenians won. The Thebans broke and retreated, but not toward the Persian camp. They pulled back toward Thebes itself, protecting their own city. This meant they weren't there when the Persian camp was attacked. The Spartans reached the Persian fortification first, but couldn't get in. They were heavy infantry, trained for phalanx combat, not siege warfare. They waited for the Athenians, who had more experience with walls and fortifications. When the Athenians arrived, they found a way through. The Tegeans were apparently the first ones to breach the walls. Then the massacre began. The Persians inside couldn't form up properly. They were packed too tightly, disorganized, leaderless. The Greeks poured through the breach and started killing. Herodotus, always prone to exaggeration, claims only 3,000 Persians survived out of the entire army that had retreated to the camp. Modern historians think that's probably the number of prisoners, and many more escaped. But the casualties were still catastrophic. Tens of thousands of Persians died that day. One Persian general, Artabazus, hadn't fully committed his troops to the battle. When he saw Mardonius die and the army breaking, he turned his entire force, reportedly 40,000 men, around and marched straight for the Hellespont. He didn't even try to help, he just left. It was arguably the smartest decision anyone made that day. His troops made it back to Asia intact. The Greeks lost comparatively few men. Herodotus claims only 159 total Greek casualties, which is obviously impossible. Plutarch, writing centuries later with access to other sources, said 360. Modern estimates range from 1,000 to 10,000 Greek dead, depending on which sources you trust and how you count the lightly armed troops. Even at the high end, it was a crushing victory. The Battle of Plataea ended Persian ambitions in Greece forever. On the same day, according to tradition, the Greek fleet destroyed what remained of the Persian navy at the Battle of Mycale on the coast of Asia Minor. The double blow was catastrophic. Xerxes had lost his army and his fleet. The greatest empire in the world couldn't conquer a handful of squabbling Greek cities. But why? How did it happen? The answer isn't simple, but it comes down to a few key factors. First, Greek heavy infantry was simply superior to Persian infantry in close combat. The phalanx, with its bronze armour and long spears and coordinated discipline, was the deadliest infantry formation in the ancient world when it could be brought to bear. The Persian infantry system was designed around flexibility, speed, and combined arms. Persian soldiers were excellent at skirmishing, at supporting cavalry, at siege warfare, but in a head-to-head shoving match with Spartan hoplites, they had no chance. Second, the Greeks had learned from their defeats. At Marathon, at Thermopylae, at Artemisium, they'd seen what Persian cavalry could do. They'd adapted. They brought archers to counter cavalry. They chose terrain that negated cavalry advantages. They developed tactics for fighting against mounted troops. The Persians, by contrast, kept using the tactics that had worked against every other enemy they'd faced. They relied on cavalry harassment and archery. When that didn't work, they charged into a fight they couldn't win. Third, Persian command and control broke down at the critical moment. Mardonius made a fatal mistake when he ordered the pursuit without proper reconnaissance or a solid plan. He saw the Greeks retreating and assumed he'd won. He charged across the river with his army in disorder, cavalry and infantry all mixed together, allied Greek troops not coordinated with Persian regulars. When the Greeks turned and fought, the Persians couldn't adapt, and when Mardonius died, there was no clear second in command. The army simply fell apart. Fourth, and this is often overlooked, the Greeks got lucky. If Pausanias' nighttime withdrawal had worked as planned, the Greeks would have been in a strong defensive position, and Mardonius might not have attacked at all. If Mardonius had been more patient, if he'd sent proper scouts, if he'd waited for the Greeks to become even more desperate from thirst and hunger, he might have won. If the rock thrown by Arimnestus had missed, if Mardonius had lived, the Persians might have rallied. War is chaos, small decisions, and random events determine outcomes. But there's a deeper reason why Plataea mattered. It proved that the Persian military system, for all its sophistication and power, had fundamental weaknesses. Persian armies were multi-ethnic forces drawn from across a vast empire. They were held together by a combination of loyalty to the great king, professional officers, and the reputation of Persian invincibility. When that reputation shattered, when elite Persian troops were beaten in open battle, the whole structure began to crack. The Greeks had shown that Persia could be defeated. Within 150 years, Alexander the Great would destroy the Persian Empire entirely, and much of his success would be built on lessons learned at Marathon and Plataea. The consequences of Plataea for Greece were equally profound. The victory secured Greek independence and allowed Greek civilization to flourish. In the decades following Plataea, Athens became the most powerful city in Greece, and funded the construction of the Parthenon, the plays of Aeschylus and Sophocles, the philosophy of Socrates. Sparta maintained its reputation as the finest military power in Greece. The Greek world entered what historians call the classical period, a time of unprecedented artistic, intellectual and political development. But Plataea also planted the seeds of future conflict. Sparta and Athens had worked together to defeat Persia, but they were fundamentally different cities with incompatible political systems and conflicting ambitions. Within 50 years, they'd be at war with each other in the devastating Peloponnesian War that would drain Greece of its power and ultimately make it vulnerable to conquest by Macedon. The unity that saved Greece at Plataea couldn't be sustained in peace. For Persia, Plataea was a humiliation, but not a catastrophe. The Achaemenid Empire would continue for another 150 years. Persian kings would continue to meddle in Greek affairs, funding one side or another in Greek civil wars. Persia remained the dominant power in the Near East. But the mystique was gone. Everyone knew now that Persian armies could be beaten, and that knowledge changed the balance of power across the entire eastern Mediterranean. The battle also had immediate tactical lessons that military commanders studied for centuries. The importance of combined arms, of using different types of troops to support each other, the vulnerability of cavalry to well-positioned infantry with missile support, the decisive nature of leadership in ancient battle. When Mardonius died, his entire army collapsed. Ancient warfare was intensely personal in ways that modern warfare isn't. Soldiers could see their commanders, could watch them fight or flee. When a commander fell, everyone knew immediately. The story of Plataea is also a reminder of how fragile victory can be. The Greeks came within hours of disaster. If they'd run out of water one day earlier, if Pausanias had panicked during the retreat, if the Persians had been more disciplined in their pursuit, everything could have been different. The Battle of Plataea looked inevitable in hindsight, a tale of Greek courage and tactical brilliance defeating Persian tyranny. But people living through it didn't know how it would end. They were terrified. They were hungry and thirsty and exhausted. They made mistakes and got lucky and somehow survived. When Persian cavalry hit the Spartan shield wall at Plataea, it was the collision of two military philosophies. The Persians represented mobility, flexibility, combined arms warfare perfected over centuries of conquest. The Spartans represented specialization, discipline, the belief that the best-trained heavy infantry could defeat any other force in close combat. Both philosophies had strengths. Both had weaknesses. On that August day in 479 BC, the Spartans won because they fought on terrain and in conditions that maximized their strengths and minimized their weaknesses. The Battle of Plataea reminds us that warfare is ultimately about more than just numbers or equipment. It's about training and discipline and leadership. It's about understanding terrain and choosing when to fight and when to wait. It's about logistics and supply lines and keeping your army fed and watered. It's about morale and belief, and the willingness to stand under an arrow storm because your comrades are standing with you. The Spartans won at Plataea because they were the best-trained infantry in the world, and because Pausanias, for all his youth and inexperience, made the right decisions at the right moments. The Persians lost because Mardonius made one critical mistake, and because their infantry couldn't match Greek hoplites in close combat. But maybe the most important lesson of Plataea is this: no military system is invincible. The Persian Empire had conquered everything from Egypt to India. Their armies had crushed kingdoms and city-states across 3 continents. They had the best cavalry in the world and tactics refined by generations of warfare. And they lost to a hastily assembled coalition of Greek cities fighting to defend their homes. Because in the end, motivation matters. The Greeks were fighting for their survival, their families, their cities, their way of life. The Persians were fighting for conquest and empire. When the battle turned brutal, when it came down to who would stand and who would break, the Greeks stood. The sun set on August 27th, 479 BC, over a plain covered with the dead. The Persians had come to conquer Greece and had been destroyed. The Greeks had saved their civilization, but had paid a terrible price. Nothing would ever be the same. The world had changed, and it had changed because of what happened when Persian cavalry hit the Spartan shield wall. The thunder of hooves, the clash of bronze, the screams of dying men, war in its rawest form. And out of that chaos and violence, Western civilization was born. The aftermath of Plataea was immediate and brutal. As the sun climbed higher on August 27th, Greek soldiers moved through the wreckage of the Persian camp, killing the wounded, stripping the dead, and collecting anything of value. The scale of the plunder was staggering. Mardonius had brought the wealth of an empire with him: gold and silver vessels, elaborate Persian carpets, silk clothing that the Greeks had never seen before, weapons inlaid with precious metals, jewellery, coins from a dozen different provinces. The common soldiers took what they could carry. The generals claimed the most valuable items to be dedicated to the gods. According to Herodotus, Pausanias ordered that Mardonius's tent be set up exactly as it had been, with all its luxuries and furnishings intact. Then he ordered a typical Spartan meal prepared, the famous black broth and barley bread that Spartan soldiers ate every day. He had both meals displayed side by side and invited the Greek commanders to look. Here was Persian luxury. Here was Spartan simplicity. Pausanias reportedly laughed and said, "See what fools these men were. They had all this, and they came to rob us of our poverty." Whether this actually happened or whether it was a story invented later to emphasize Spartan values, we'll never know. But it captures something real about how the Greeks understood their victory. They'd beaten an empire that had everything by being men who needed nothing but their shields and their spears and their commitment to each other. The Greeks buried their dead with honours. The Spartans, Tegeans, and Athenians each had their own burial mounds. The Spartans divided their fallen into 2 groups, the regular warriors and the young men who hadn't yet completed their military training but had fought anyway. Both groups received elaborate funerals. For Sparta, a society built entirely around military excellence, the dead at Plataea were heroes who would be remembered forever. Their names were inscribed on monuments. Their families received honours. Spartan women were told that their sons and husbands had died in the most glorious way possible, defending Greece against the barbarian hordes. The Athenians honoured their dead differently. Athens was a democracy, and democratic ideology emphasised equality among citizens. The Athenian dead were cremated together, and their ashes were placed in a common grave. A single monument was erected listing all the names. No individual was elevated above the others. They had all served Athens. They had all died as equals. This difference in burial practices reflected the fundamental divide between Sparta and Athens that would eventually tear Greece apart. Sparta was a hierarchical military state. Athens was an egalitarian democracy. They'd work together to defeat Persia, but they could never work together in peace. The Greeks also had to decide what to do with the massive quantity of plunder. A tenth was set aside for the gods. Offerings were sent to Delphi, to Olympia, to other major sanctuaries. These weren't just religious gestures, they were political statements. By dedicating Persian spoils to the Greek gods, the victors were claiming divine favour. They were saying that the gods themselves had chosen Greece over Persia. Another portion was distributed among the cities according to the size of their contribution to the battle. Sparta got the largest share. Athens got the second largest. Smaller cities received smaller portions, and individual soldiers kept whatever they'd personally looted from the battlefield. But there was one treasure that couldn't be divided. A Persian noblewoman, reportedly one of Mardonius's concubines, was found in the camp. She was so beautiful and so richly dressed that the Greeks didn't know what to do with her. Eventually she was given to Pausanias as a prize of war. Ancient sources suggest Pausanias was captivated by her, and that she influenced him in later years toward pro-Persian sympathies. Whether that's true or propaganda spread by Pausanias's political enemies, we'll never know, but it's a reminder that ancient warfare wasn't clean or noble. Women were property. The victors took what they wanted. This woman, whose name we don't even know for certain, went from being the companion of a Persian general to being the possession of a Greek one. Her thoughts and feelings and experiences are lost to history. The Greeks then had to deal with those who'd collaborated with Persia. The most prominent were the Thebans. Thebes had sided with the Persians early in the war and had fought against the other Greeks at Plataea. When the battle was over, the victorious Greeks demanded that Thebes surrender the leaders who'd pushed for collaboration. Thebes initially refused. The Greek army marched on Thebes and laid siege to the city. After 20 days, with their city facing destruction, the Theban leaders agreed to surrender themselves. They were taken to Corinth and executed. It was brutal justice, but from the Greek perspective, it was necessary. Collaboration with Persia was the ultimate betrayal. Those who'd sided with the enemy had chosen the wrong side and would pay the ultimate price. The execution of the Theban leaders sent a message across Greece. Persia had lost. Anyone who'd supported them was now in danger. Cities that had Medised, the Greek term for siding with the Medes or Persians, either sent ambassadors to beg forgiveness or prepared for war. Some cities were punished with fines or loss of territory. Others were allowed to rejoin the Greek alliance without penalty. It was all politics, all calculation. The powerful cities like Athens and Sparta could afford to be selective about which collaborators to punish and which to forgive. Smaller cities had no choice but to accept whatever terms they were offered. Meanwhile, far from Plataea, the rest of the Persian army was trying to get home. Artabazus, the general who'd retreated early with 40,000 men, led his forces on a grueling march back to the Hellespont. They had to move through hostile territory. Greek cities that had previously submitted to Persia now saw that the Persians were defeated and vulnerable. Some cities attacked the retreating Persians. Others just refused to provide food or supplies. Artabazus had to fight several small battles and lose men to starvation and disease. But he kept his force together and eventually reached the crossing point back to Asia. He'd saved a significant portion of the army, and for that Xerxes would later reward him. But most of the Persian survivors from the actual battle at Plataea weren't so lucky. Thousands of men scattered across the countryside trying to find their way home. Greek patrols hunted them down. Local populations murdered isolated Persian soldiers for whatever they carried. Some Persians were enslaved. Some were ransomed back to the empire. Most simply died. We'll never know the exact casualty figures, but modern historians estimate that between 40,000 and 70,000 Persian and allied soldiers died at Plataea or in the immediate aftermath. It was one of the bloodiest defeats in ancient military history, The news of Plataea reached Xerxes in Sardis. According to the ancient sources, the great king reacted with rage and grief. Mardonius had been his trusted general, a relative by marriage, the man he'd left in charge of completing the conquest of Greece. Now Mardonius was dead, and the army was destroyed. Xerxes had no choice but to accept defeat. Persia would never again launch a major invasion of Greece. The western frontier of the empire was secured at the coast of Asia Minor. Everything beyond that was lost. But Xerxes didn't give up on Greece entirely. He just changed tactics. Instead of trying to conquer the Greeks, Persia would pay them to fight each other. Over the following decades, Persian gold flowed into Greece, funding one city-state against another. When Athens became too powerful, Persia funded Sparta. When Sparta became too powerful, Persia funded Athens. It was cheaper than war and often more effective. The Greeks called it Persian gold, and they both despised and desperately wanted it. Cities that claimed to fight for Greek freedom had no problem accepting Persian money if it helped them defeat their rivals. The victory at Plataea transformed Pausanias into a Greek hero, but it also destroyed him. As the commanding general of the victorious army, Pausanias was celebrated across Greece. Monuments were erected in his honour. Poets sang his praises. For a young man in his 20s, it must have been intoxicating. But Pausanias made a fatal mistake. He started acting like a Persian king rather than a Spartan general. He wore Persian clothing, he adopted Persian customs, he surrounded himself with luxury, and worst of all, he was suspected of negotiating secretly with Xerxes, possibly trying to become a Persian puppet ruler of Greece. The Spartans were horrified. Everything about Spartan culture emphasized austerity, discipline, and equality among citizens. Pausanias' behaviour was a direct violation of these values. He was recalled to Sparta and put on trial for medising, for collaborating with Persia. The evidence was apparently inconclusive, and he was acquitted. But his reputation was ruined. He went into exile and eventually took refuge in a temple. The Spartans, unwilling to violate the sanctuary of the temple by dragging him out, simply walled up the entrance and let him starve to death inside. The hero of Plataea died alone and disgraced, killed by the same rigid cultural values that had made his victory possible. Athens benefited most from the victory at Plataea. With the Persian threat eliminated, Athens transformed from a military alliance leader into an imperial power. The Delian League, originally formed as a defensive alliance against Persia, gradually became an Athenian empire. Athens demanded tribute from its allies, stationed troops in allied cities, and ruthlessly crushed any attempt at independence. The city grew wealthy beyond imagination. The silver mines at Laurium poured out coins. Tribute flowed in from hundreds of cities across the Aegean, and this wealth funded the golden age of Athenian culture. The Parthenon, built between 447 and 432 BC, was a direct result of the victory at Plataea. The temple was constructed with tribute money from the Delian League, money that was supposed to be used for the common defence but was instead used to beautify Athens. The sculptures and architecture of the Parthenon represented the height of classical Greek art, and much of it depicted the Greek victory over Persia. The metapiece showed Greeks fighting Persians. The frieze celebrated Athenian military and civic virtue. The entire temple was a monument to Greek superiority over the barbarian East. The plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides were performed in theatres built with wealth from the empire. Aeschylus himself had fought at Marathon, and possibly at Plataea. His play, The Persians, performed in 472 BC, just 7 years after Plataea, dramatised the Persian defeat from the Persian perspective. It's the oldest surviving complete play in Western literature, and it's a direct response to the Persian Wars. The play shows Persian characters mourning their losses, questioning their king's decisions, and struggling to understand how they'd been defeated by the Greeks. It's remarkable for its sympathy toward the enemy, but it's also a celebration of Greek victory. The message was clear. Even in defeat, even seen through their own eyes, the Persians couldn't match Greek excellence. Philosophy flourished in post-Plataea Athens. Socrates, born around 470 BC, grew up in a city transformed by victory and wealth. His philosophical method, questioning everything and accepting nothing on authority, was possible only in a society that valued free inquiry. Socrates himself fought as a hoplite in the Peloponnesian War, and his military service shaped his philosophy. The discipline and courage required in the phalanx became metaphors for intellectual and moral virtue. Stand your ground, face your fears, don't break ranks. These military values became philosophical principles, but the victory at Plataea also corrupted Athens. Power and wealth led to arrogance. Athens began treating its allies as subjects, its friends as potential enemies. Democratic Athens, which had fought Persia to preserve Greek freedom, became an oppressive imperial power that denied freedom to others. The contradiction was obvious to everyone, and critics like Thucydides pointed it out repeatedly. Athens had become what it had defeated. Not literally Persia, but a similar kind of domineering empire that demanded submission and crushed resistance. Sparta, meanwhile, grew increasingly paranoid. The Spartan system was built on the subjugation of the Helots, a massive population of enslaved Greeks who outnumbered Spartan citizens by perhaps 7 to 1. Every Spartan male lived in constant fear of Helot rebellion. The victory at Plataea made this fear worse, not better. Spartan citizens had fought far from home, leaving Sparta vulnerable. What if the Helots had risen up while the army was away? What if Athens, flush with victory and confidence, decided to encourage Helot rebellion? These fears drove Spartan policy for the next 50 years. Sparta became increasingly isolated, increasingly conservative, increasingly focused on internal security rather than external adventure. The tension between Athens and Sparta was inevitable. They'd always been rivals, but they'd cooperated against Persia because they had to. With Persia defeated, there was no reason to cooperate anymore. Athens represented democracy, naval power, trade, culture, and imperial expansion. Sparta represented oligarchy, land power, military discipline, and conservative isolation. They couldn't coexist as equal powers. Someone had to dominate, and neither was willing to submit. The Peloponnesian War broke out in 431 BC, just 48 years after Plataea. It lasted 27 years and devastated Greece. Athens and Sparta fought each other to exhaustion. Tens of thousands died in battle. Entire cities were massacred. Plague ravaged Athens, killing perhaps a third of its population. The war destroyed the Greek Golden Age and left both Athens and Sparta weakened. And the cruel irony was that Persia funded both sides at different times, playing the Greeks against each other exactly as Xerxes had planned. The Persian perspective on Plataea was complex. Yes, they'd been defeated. Yes, they'd lost an army and a great general. But the Achaemenid Empire was so vast that one defeat, even a major one, didn't threaten its existence. Persia controlled Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, the Levant, and stretched east to India. Greece was a small, poor, divided backwater on the western frontier. Losing Greece was embarrassing, but not catastrophic. Persian kings would continue to rule the largest empire in the world for another 150 years. Persian military tactics didn't fundamentally change after Plataea. The cavalry remained the core of Persian military power. The combined arms approach of cavalry, archers, and light infantry continued to work against most enemies. The problem at Plataea wasn't that Persian tactics were bad, it was that they'd been used poorly against an enemy that had specifically prepared to counter them. Mardonius had made critical mistakes. He'd chosen bad terrain for cavalry operations. He'd allowed his army to become disordered during the pursuit. He'd personally led a cavalry charge against the best heavy infantry in the world. These were command failures, not systemic problems. Later Persian commanders learned from Plataea. When they fought Greeks, they avoided head-on engagements with the phalanx. They used their cavalry more carefully. They fought on favourable terrain, and they won plenty of battles. The idea that Plataea proved Greek military superiority is oversimplified. It proved that the Spartan phalanx was nearly unstoppable in close combat on favourable terrain. But Greek armies lost plenty of battles to Persian forces before and after Plataea. Military superiority is always contextual, always dependent on circumstances. The real lesson of Plataea was about strategic overreach. Xerxes had tried to conquer Greece with an army that was too large to supply, operating too far from its base, in terrain that didn't favour its tactics. The invasion was a logistical nightmare, moving hundreds of thousands of men across the Hellespont, feeding them for months, coordinating dozens of different ethnic contingents with different languages and customs. It was ambitious to the point of madness. Mardonius had tried to finish what Xerxes started, but with a smaller force and the same strategic problems. He couldn't supply his army indefinitely in hostile territory. He couldn't control the terrain. He couldn't prevent the Greeks from choosing when and where to fight. Plataea was the inevitable result of strategic decisions made months earlier. The Greeks understood this. Herodotus, writing about 30 years after Plataea, emphasized Persian hubris. Xerxes had been too proud, too confident. He'd thought he could conquer anything. The gods had punished him for his arrogance. This interpretation fit Greek religious and cultural beliefs about pride and nemesis, but it also contained a practical lesson. Don't overextend. Don't fight where your strengths become weaknesses. Know your limitations. These lessons would be forgotten and relearned countless times throughout military history. The memory of Plataea shaped Greek identity for centuries. Greeks defined themselves partly by what they weren't. They weren't Persians. They weren't barbarians. They were free men who'd defeated the slave armies of Oriental despotism. This was propaganda, of course. Persian soldiers weren't slaves, and many Greeks lived under oligarchies or tyrannies. But the myth was powerful. It told Greeks that they were special, that their way of life was worth dying for, that small free communities could defeat giant empires. This myth influenced everything from Greek art to Greek politics to Greek philosophy. When Alexander the Great invaded Persia in 334 BC, he explicitly framed his campaign as revenge for Xerxes' invasion. Alexander visited Troy and made sacrifices at the tomb of Achilles. He crossed the Hellespont at the same point Xerxes had crossed, symbolically reversing the Persian invasion. His army included descendants of men who'd fought at Plataea, and his tactics were based on the same principles: heavy infantry phalanx supported by cavalry, aggressive leadership, and willingness to fight decisive battles. Alexander conquered the entire Persian Empire in just 11 years, but he was building on foundations laid at Marathon and Plataea. The Battle of Plataea ultimately determined the course of Western civilization. If Persia had won, if Mardonius had destroyed the Greek army, Greece would have been absorbed into the Persian Empire. There would have been no Athenian Golden Age, no Parthenon, no Sophocles or Socrates, no development of democracy as a viable political system. Western philosophy, science, and art would have developed very differently, if at all. This isn't to say Persian civilization was inferior. Persia had its own rich culture, its own achievements in art and architecture and administration, but it was different. And if Persia had conquered Greece, that difference would have shaped everything that came after. We can trace a direct line from Plataea to modern Western civilization. Greek philosophy influenced Roman thought. Roman thought influenced Christian theology. Christian theology shaped medieval Europe. The Renaissance was a rediscovery of Greek and Roman culture. The Enlightenment built on Renaissance humanism. Modern democracy, science, and human rights all have roots that extend back through this chain to classical Greece. And classical Greece existed because a few thousand men stood on a dusty plain in 479 BC and refused to break when Persian cavalry and infantry attacked them. This is why Plataea matters. Not just as a military battle, though it was certainly that. Not just as a dramatic story, though it's one of the great stories of ancient warfare. Plataea matters because it was a hinge point in history. One of those rare moments when the outcome of a single day determined the future of entire civilizations. The Spartans didn't know they were fighting for the future of Western philosophy and democracy. They were just trying to survive, trying to protect their homes, trying to stand their ground under an arrow storm because that's what Spartans did. But their courage and discipline and willingness to stand when everything rational told them to run changed the world. The story of Plataea is ultimately a human story. It's about men in bronze armour standing, in the hot sun, scared and tired and thirsty, waiting for orders to advance. It's about Persian cavalrymen who'd ridden across half the world to fight in this strange country, with its stone mountains and tiny cities. It's about generals making decisions that would determine whether they lived or died, whether their names would be remembered or forgotten. It's about the chaos of battle, where plans fall apart and survival depends on training and luck and the man standing next to you. It's about victory and defeat, courage and fear, loyalty and betrayal. All the fundamental human experiences compressed into a few hours on a battlefield in ancient Greece. When Persian cavalry hit the Spartan shield wall at Plataea, two worlds collided, east and west, empire and city-state, cavalry and infantry, flexibility and discipline. Both sides fought with courage. Both sides suffered terrible losses, but only one side could win. And on that August day in 479 BC, the Spartans won because they were better prepared, better positioned, better led, and because they simply refused to break. The Persians learned that day that no amount of cavalry, no volume of arrows, no numerical superiority could overcome men who would rather die than retreat. It was a lesson written in blood and bronze on the plains of Boeotia, and the echoes of that lesson still resonate 2,500 years later, every time we think about courage, sacrifice, and what it means to stand your ground when everything tells you to run.